I would really like to welcome you all on behalf of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory of the University of Belgrade. It is really an immense pleasure and honor for my institution and for me personally to be co-organizers of this colloquium that brings together such distinguished presenters from around the globe. This event was originally planned rather modestly. Sanja Bojanić approached me with an idea to do a seminar on Rada Iveković's brilliant book, The Politics of Translation, which was recently translated to our language. And these seminars are usually relatively common events at my institute. We invite like 5 to 8 presenters to talk about a new book, and we give the chance to the author to respond to questions and comments. So in a way, it's an attempt to spur an academic and often hermetic debate and discussion about a new book that we deem important. However, in this case, Rada got involved, and she brought great energy and efforts and suggested best speakers and communicated with them. And so it soon became clear that this is not going to be a couple of hours seminar about her book, but a 2-day colloquium about the translation itself and the politics of translation in particular. And modest as she is, she first demanded that we move her from the first panel towards the last. And she also demanded that we delete the information that this was essentially about her book. And so when I look at the program now, it seems to me that it gives somewhat a false impression about her role in the event. And I think Joyce once said that, you know, writer should be outside of his work like God, you know, cleaning his nails. And it seems to me that her role in this event is more described like that of a god in Newton's, you know, mechanics, who sets all this in motion and then goes, you know, is somewhere in the foreground. In her book, Rada says that translation is the only universal language. And hence, I'm really grateful and indebted to Sanja and Rada for putting together this ambitious event about translation that gathers people from East and West and North and South, and therefore, in its intention, of course, wishes to treat this universal language of translation from a global perspective. In the next 2 days, I expect to hear various reflections on the issue of politics of translation and the relation between translation and nation, gender, race, and so on. What this politics of translation is and what it could be, I guess, remains an open question. Rada herself, in her book, uses different points throughout. Thus, while she's ready to claim that translation, understood in the political sense of the politics of translation, can help in deactivating violence, she doesn't idolize translation. And she also warns that language and translations can be instruments of peace, but also carriers of violence. And this resonates well with anyone familiar with Yugoslav context, where the violent partition of the state and the violent partition of the common language were parallel processes. And while these processes of partition are still ongoing, defying it in the form of subscribing to a rather unpopular claim that we still share a common language is a form of particular politics of translation that defies partitions, hostility, and violence. In yet another way, and I think this is closer to Balibar and Derrida, this politics of translation is articulated in Rada's book as a form of opening of Europe to its decolonization, which it buries in her head, in her language itself. And so she argues that to accept the diversity is necessary for Europe's preservation and future. So I conclude this brief welcome with a quotation from the end of Rada's book. Translation by itself does not ensure anything. First and foremost, what is needed is a politics of translation and cultural politics, of course, with a political project to occur. Only then can translation be used as an opener of shared meaning. Sharing inklings of sense, sharing one's mind, the other's reasoning, and reasoning with others would already be a good beginning of a politics of translation at the level of the living, and therefore acceptable to the humans too. So I hope that this event will be precisely that, mutual sharing of thoughts and ideas. So I welcome you, and I look forward to participating and partaking and listening in this sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha.
Yes, even though it would be wonderful to have you all on our island in the Moise Palace, the Universities of Rijeka's Education and Research Retreat and the Center for Advanced Studies, I'm glad that we can follow the net zero policies and be present in the same moment on different continents and corners of the world. So welcome. Reiterating Sasha, and together with Rada, the main suspect of the event, whose relentless energy and talent managed to gather us all here, I wholeheartedly thank you for accepting our invitation to join us. Translation is political because it is a relation, a context of negotiating power, states Rada Senkipet. This sentence alone provokes a flux of interpretations with possible combinations of the equation between relation, context, negotiation, and power. It also channels this conceptual heavy artillery into no man's land, where by all means translation belongs, and where the gathering on politics, translating politics, should always start. Time zones are of the essence. We planned 2 working days divided into sessions, and each day from Australia, India, over Europe and European time areas to Argentina and the United States, we will spend 2 morning hours for Nivedita or Brett evenings, but Noki or Veronica, Manuel or Felvin, very early mornings, and a couple of hours or so within the Central European time afternoons. Allow me to thank in advance Paul Stubbs, who is co-chairing as a discussant our first session with the Boaventura de Sousa Santos, Learned Ignorance, the Gold Method of Intercultural Translation, Etienne Balibar, Translation and Federation, European Problem, and Françoise Vergès on Speaking of State and Capitalist Violence. Paul, I'm hearing if needed, but please engage whenever you think there is a room for a discussion. Many thanks to Manuel Rebon, the editor who published the translation of Rada's book in Argentina. Please check the chat of the Zoom. Manuel is today a discussant in the afternoon session from 2 p.m. to 4:30 with Veronica Gago. Translation of Struggles on Feminist Keywords, Marinella Matejcic, Reframing and Reshaping the Feminist Narrative Practice is the theory is practice. And Naoki Sakai is joining us from the East US Coast with the presentation The International World, the Modern Regime of Translation. Due to difficulties in planning, we couldn't match Naoki and Jon Solomon, but Jon, please join this session if possible, and thank you for being
He's there.
He's there. Yes, I see. Yes. So each presentation should take approximately 20 minutes, as you all know, and 10 minutes of discussion. Now, as you probably noticed in the program, Making Sense Through Translation is my ambitious title. I promise that my 2 proposed premises will not burden an already complex and coherent conference agenda. Please hear them more in the guise of an introduction to the topic and an illustration of my concern. More than 20 years ago, I was lucky to translate Antoine Maillet's short but seminal piece, Comment les mots changent le sens. The encounter with this text brought to my knowledge theories of translation, general linguistics and sociolinguistics, and the complexities of the philosophy of language. It also gave me the frame of reference of how any translation, and we are aware of its plurality, becomes intelligible. Various schools and sometimes opposed approaches argue for and against different statuses of meaning, but always deal with language as a process and dynamic that in return surprises us with its sense. This process of providing meaning never stops. And even when to the fore, it brings not only usual nonsense, but a nonsense with a hyphen, like in times out of joint, which is when it gets inconceivable, so challenging to understand and accept during war atrocities and extreme violences. That process still keeps its internal logic intact. What do we do when we are confronted with such intense experiences? Are we lost in translation? Thank you, Sofia Coppola. Or stuck and halted in a position of numbness, frozen or fawning, hoping to build some sense and move forward, awaking fight or flight modes? What is it that we do? Before resisting, we still go on with the translation. This is what we always do. And our tools are always words. Words that, in this process, change the meaning. Words that build or unbuild discourses which make sense to us. What does making sense work for those who are not us, qui ne sont pas de nôtres? Are we in the capacity to analyze it careless for the frame of reference of those who are not us? So here are my signs by the roadside. Moise presented the first version of the Comment les mots changent le sens in the 9e année sociologique, 1904-1905, which was just the start of the long process of establishing language as a social fact. In 1921, he revisited his text, proposing a version which we now read and consult. Some 20 years before his first expose in the late 80s of the 19th century, Émile Littré kept a lexical diary, how he called his dictionary, under the same title, aiming at, according to his own words in the foreword, collecting une série d'anomalies dans la langue, inclined to medical analogies of the epoch. So he worked on pathologie verbale ou lésion de certains mots dans le cours de l'usage. First premise. In 40 years between two texts with identical titles, linguistics at least lost its squareness of normalization and entered the realm of the social. Already Michel Bréal critically assessed Littré, who arbitrarily presented in the form of a narrative some 98 words that radically changed their meaning over centuries. What Littré did. He personified each word as the hero of a story whose plot contained discontinuity. Moise's approach, on the contrary, is scientific, with the lexicography open to linguistics and closely developed with social sciences. Moise, Henri Hubert, Robert Hertz often quote him as their reference. And the choice of the journal, Année Sociologique, already speaks for itself. At the beginning of the text, Moise writes about the direct influence of Durkheim and his approach to systematically observing the social world. Unfortunately, there is no time now to overlook all elements in which Moise differs from, for example, Saussure. Grammar, even psychology or physiology, are insufficient in demonstrating irregularities and limits of the language, states Moise, while establishing synchronic linguistics that showed the impossibility of a strict separation of analytical categories and more generally between synchrony and diachrony. Explaining grammaticalization as a diachronic linguistic process, Moise observes the transformation of a purely lexicographic word into a grammatical element, noticing that the phenomenon of grammaticalization is present in all natural languages, and thanks to it, its cyclical occurrence enables new language constructions. Moise presents changes in the meaning of words under the influence of various social factors, such as the establishment of relations between different populations, the transition of words from a specific to a general language or changes within institutions that are also reflected in differences in the vocabulary of the language itself, which was in a certain way continued with the framework, within the framework of sociology of lexicology by Georges Matoret. More time is needed to explore further the connection I wish to establish between changes in the meaning of words regarding semantics and semiotics and current theories, for example, and techniques of natural language processes, especially about the social realm and violent extremes that we are currently facing. So my second premise is shorter. Charles Taylor published his book, The Language Animal, The Full Shape of the Human Linguistic Capacity, in 2016, inspired by Hamann, Herder, and Humboldt, and their views on language development. In his way of making meaning of life, which is Taylor's great enterprise from his early writings, he embraced the German Romantics as a contrast to Hobbes, Locke, and Condillac, and modern epistemological theories which grew out of and sometimes partly against the work of Descartes. HLC theory, how Taylor calls them, seems impossibly unsophisticated to thinkers in the 20th and in 21st centuries, influenced by Saussure, Frege, and to some extent Humboldt. But certain critical assumptions of this theory have survived into analytic post-Fregean philosophy and cognitive theory. What did Charles Taylor write at the beginning of the Trump era, and how did he perceive the meaningful democracy? This is Taylor's expression. Following his own words, his task is to refute the remaining fragments of the legacy of the HLC by developing insights out of the Hamann, Herder, and Humboldt. In other words, he undertakes a project which should demonstrate the human capacity for thinking and understanding, which is not only algorithmic. That is the project that includes capabilities for meaning creation, which go far beyond that of encoding and communicating information, which is nowadays too often taken as its primary form. So language is not a tool of human animals developed to encode and communicate information. Taylor explains that this view neglects the important role language plays in shaping the very thought it purports to express. Language does not merely describe, it constitutes meaning and fundamentally shapes human experience. The human linguistic capacity is not something we innately possess. We first learn language from others and induct it into the shared speech practice, translate others to ourselves, translate ourselves to others, and our individual selves emerge out of the conversation. So this is a good moment to make a halt and leave the floor